Hello to everybody who is joining us, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Jessica Zimmerman Graf, the Senior Rabbi at Congregation Shereth Israel. And I want to welcome people from near and far. I know that we have people participating in the discussion today who have joined us from all over the country and perhaps even the world. We're lucky on Zoom to be able to welcome people from very far away, to hear these two amazing educators and to share their perspectives on the complicated world that we're living in right now. In the last 3 weeks, as you know, our country has been rocked by conversations of racial injustice, and these conversations have come to the forefront in our society. It's certainly not a new problem, but it's being addressed in a new way, and it gives us the hope that there will be real change this time. So here at Congregation Shereth Israel, which is a reform synagogue in San Francisco, our Social Action Committee is very active and has been planning now over these weeks diligently many learning opportunities and also action opportunities for how our community can engage with social justice issues and racial justice reform issues in San Francisco and beyond. This conversation today sets the stage for our next steps, and I'm so glad to have all of you here for this important opening conversation. As Jews, we are committed to the words of our Torah, to the Hebrew Bible, which is a sacred text shared by many of us. And I know that it is an important text to our guests as well. In Leviticus 19, we learn, do not stand idly by while your neighbor's blood is shed. This commandment, this instruction really leads us forward in this moment. It is our obligation to participate in a change which will enable all people to live in dignity. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel famously said many years ago when he participated in the civil rights movement, in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And we take seriously our responsibility to contribute to a solution to the problems that we see in our society. So it is my incredibly great pleasure and privilege to introduce our two speakers today, Robert Greene and Wanda Holland Greene, who are nationally renowned educators working in schools and workplaces to change the culture, to educate about anti-racism, cultural competency, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Robert works specifically with for-profit and not-for-profit entities to change efficiency and productivity by changing the culture, internal culture in these places, and to help people understand the way that work culture impacts work product. Wanda is an educator with an expertise in girls' education and women's education, and is helping to build a strong new generation of women. And it just so happens she's one of my heroes. Sheroes, I was gonna say, sheroes. So we are just really, really grateful that both of you took this time out of your incredibly busy schedules to be with us. And we want to learn about your experiences as humans, as educators, as San Franciscans, and as teachers in the realm of anti-racism and change for our society. So I'd love you to start today by giving us some definitions of vocabulary words that we use a lot in a lot of contexts, and I just even use some of them: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Could you please help us understand what the words mean so that we can all use them in the same way?
Absolutely. Rabbi Jessica Graf and the Shereth Israel family, it is our absolute pleasure to be here with you. And I want to do a little bit of a level set, if you will, because as my grandfather used to tell me, understanding is a wonderful thing. So if we have some clarity on shared definition, it'll allow us to be more efficient as we're trying to talk together about these really important concepts. I'm going to share a screen, and Peter, I'm hoping that this goes seamlessly. So I'm hoping everybody is with me. Get a thumbs up from a couple. Now, part of the reason we like to describe these as pithy definitions is because we want them to be usable. We don't want people struggling to try to recall a 7,000 word definition. So when we talk about diversity, we're really talking about the differences that exist in a particular community. And this is myriad dimension of cultural identity. And I have a graphic which I think will illustrate it better. But diversity represents the differences. Inclusion is qualitatively different. That's about the experiences that folks have. Now, the way that they function together, inclusion is the key to unlocking diversity, because as people will often say, diversity is about counting heads. Inclusion is about making the heads count. You know, if you want a little more artistic reference, diversity is asking somebody to the dance, and inclusion is making sure that they do dance once they get there. Now, this notion, again, of what diversity means, literally these 15 different dimensions. We all have identity in all these dimensions, but we haven't necessarily explored all of them with the same degree of intensity, the same degree of frequency. We just haven't been as reflective in some of these than others. And for the way that we've moved through our lives, some of these dimensions of identity may have played a bigger role in shaping our experiences, our perspective, et cetera. For tonight, one of the things we're really centering on is racial identity, but race is just one of many. The concept of cultural competency, that's a skill set, even more than a value proposition. And that set of skills allows us to create experiences of inclusion across a diversity of identities. And so when we think about cultural competency, when we think about creating inclusion for folks, it's actually more of an outcome of our behavior than it even is our concepts, our value proposition, our thoughts. We really have to make sure that we are living our values for people to feel included. Cultural competency is how we do it. The notion of equity, I often like to talk about this as applied cultural competency, because it has to manifest at the systemic level and the cultural level beyond the particular connection that we may have individually. When we talk about equity, it has to be built into organizational and cultural systems. So the likelihood is that everybody is going to feel included. That's intentional, that's systemic, even more than individual connection. Some other terms that we may use throughout the night: bias or prejudice or discrimination. And in many ways, these are talking about mindsets. And then, of course, some really big dimensions of this conversation: race and ethnicity. Race has no biological foundation, but it's a hugely important social construct. Ethnicity is actually the intersection of race and culture and geography. They're different. My racial identity is Black. My ethnic identity is African American, because there are other Black experiences that are not specific to America. When we talk about racism and racist policies, huge, huge field here. But essentially, if we work our way from the bottom up, being anti-racist, which is the call that we're heeding tonight, that literally means supporting or promoting anti-racist policies, promoting and supporting inclusion and equity in our policy and our practice. And we have to do that through a context of power. Racism is the marriage of ideas that promote racial inequity. So where we're going tonight, Rabbi Jessica, is to be anti-racist. Hopefully the definition is helped to do a little bit of level set. And if we need to come back to them, we can.
Thank you so much for a great introduction to what we're gonna jump into. I'd like to talk a little bit about how we define, you showed us the slide with so many different aspects of our identities coming together to make a full person, and we rely on some more than others at different times. Can you talk, both of you, a little bit about the relative balance between our religious identity and our racial identities, and also ethnic identities, as you outlined that, Robert? How is this conversation different taking place in the context of a religious community or a faith-based values community? And I know that each of you comes from a minister's family. Wanda, your father was a minister, and Robert, your grandfather was a minister. So these texts that our Jewish community hold to be sacred texts at our core are texts also that you grew up with and that inform your worldview. So maybe, I don't know, which one of you will start with? Maybe Wanda, will you jump in?
Sure, I'll step in. Thank you, Jessica. It's such a pleasure to be here. I just want to say the names of my parents, right? James David Holland was my dad, is my dad. Juanita Powell Holland is my mom. And, you know, I joke around and say that I was born on a church pew because we spent so much time in church. My sister, Donna, has tuned in. I can see her in the chat already, and she can verify that we were in church all the time. And part of this kind of inextricable link between our Blackness and our religious faith was that the church was the place was the balm in Gilead, if you will. It was the place where our identity was affirmed and where we also received tools to navigate the larger world. And so I can't actually take apart my religious identity and my racial identity. I speak from my perspective. Some people might, maybe some people don't find religion and faith to be core for them, but for me, both are inextricably linked because of my upbringing and because of how I live now. I would say that for me, and as I think about this topic tonight, I think about my father and the stories. In fact, when Robert and I were thinking about the topic, the title tonight and the topic, we put heeding the call to anti-racism, and the heeding the call part harkens back to the story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho. This idea that, you know, there are ram's horn trumpets and there are people walking around the wall. I mean, if you could just imagine, those of you who are on this call who might not know that story, it's a good one about, you know, the Jews walking around the wall 7 days. They're probably like, day 3 was like, hello, God, where are you? But you know, you go around that wall the 7th time, and then you shout at the wall and you blow the ram's horns, and the walls came tumbling down, right? And so we are saying tonight that as we're walking and walking and walking and walking around this wall, trying to dismantle these systems that Robert was talking about, my faith tradition says to me, it's possible. My father loved saying, you know, the impossible is God's play toy. And he loved telling us the stories of Moses and Aaron taking, you know, the Jews across dry ground. He loved the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal and on Mount Carmel, and, you know, making it hard for the water, you know, so that it would rain. And, you know, I mean, it was just this incredible classroom in my house where we learned about faith and tenacity. We learned about hope in the unseen. We learned about the power of confession and forgiveness. That's a part of many, many religious traditions in our identity, that we truly believe that in order to dismantle racist systems, some people have to confess. You know, some people have got to ask for forgiveness, and maybe we all do in some way, shape, or form. But this work, whether we're talking about reparations or we're talking about just saying, ooh, I'm sorry, I said that to you. I'm really intrigued by this incident that happened in our very own neighborhood of Pacific Heights, that maybe people have seen, that really distressing video. Won't say any names, but that couple knows who they are. And I'm intrigued to see if the man who lives in the house will sit down with you know, the couple and have coffee. What is the space for restoration and atonement within the context of taking down the walls of racism? So faith, the power of confession and forgiveness, and also courage as a part of our, you know, thinking about what it means to be Black and a person of faith. We also believe that it requires tremendous courage to just get up in the morning and to do your work in the world and to have a sense of who you are as you walk through the world. And Robert and I parent the 2 most amazing, delicious boys, David and Jonathan. And it's also terrifying, and we can get to that. But you know, if you want to get a church of people going, you know, you sing a song called "If I Perish, I Perish, I'm Going to See the King." There's this kind of courageous way to get into yourself, to feel in your bones that you're going to make it, that you can do it. And so for me, Jessica, my faith, hope in the unseen, I truly believe, as an educator, as a mom, as a spouse, as a person, I believe that the world will be different. I can't tell you how long it's going to take, but I believe the world will be different. My faith is secure in that. I believe that confession and forgiveness are going to have to be a part of this. And I believe that it's going to take a tremendous amount of courage, the courage of Esther. She's my favorite. We didn't have daughters, Robert. Oh, well, but you know, Esther's my favorite. And I think about her as a head of a school. I walk into meetings often with that, if I perish, I perish, because there are some things that are worth dying for.
Okay, wow, you have hundreds of daughters, but that's an
435 to be exact.
That's an awesome introduction, giving us the inextricably linked values that go together in your world. Robert, will you tell us how you connect these pieces of your identity?
Absolutely. I want to complement some of what Wanda said. So I don't want to be repetitive, but there are a couple of themes that continue to resonate for us. One is, again, the role that faith has played for us historically. And so when I think about my own experience as a Black man in America, as the grandson of an African Methodist Episcopal preacher, this notion of faith and our relationship with God being a bedrock of our resilience and our perseverance, it's not only very Christian, it's also very Black, particularly as we think about the evolution of the civil rights movement. And home for me is Atlanta, so it resonates very deeply in that space. I also think about this concept of friendship. And so Wanda said that our sons are named David and Jonathan. So I often joke that we named them David and Jonathan, and so far it's working, right? So this notion of the deep connection that friends have to one another, and you know, what that means in terms of being a friend, what it costs to be a friend, what you have to commit to be a friend. And so it's framed a lot of the way that I look to walk in the world with that commitment, you know, to the ones whom I love, to the ones that I'm trying to support, the ones whom I care for. So all that is a particular grounding, but I want to add this additional dimension. And I've also lived a racialized experience as a Christian. And it's such an important note to make, especially in this moment, because as I said, my family is Southern, and there's a lot of Christianity in the South, and ironically, it's based upon the model of Christ. And when I work with faith-based organizations in particular, especially Christian ones, I'll often tell them that Christ was the most radically inclusive cat I've ever heard of, right? So this notion of suspending judgment and being open to the diversity of background and experience, that's part of the model. But it manifests very differently for many Christians, especially depending on your race and how your race has impacted the way that you've had to move through the world. And so this notion of either Christians or Jews having a different experience in their faith identity based on their race is something that we need to pay more attention to, that we need to particularly unpack, because it does create differences for the role that faith can play for us, because our identity is not simply what we radiate out. The other half of it is what society is reflecting back on us. And that's often living at the group stage and not the individual stage. So when I walk around the corner and on the streets in Pacific Heights, or actually wherever I go, quite honestly, I'm never stopping to recognize that I am a Black man in this world, and the world is looking at me as such. So once you talk to me, you may figure out that my grandfather was a Christian, and he said, you know, that I was the one he was thinking would go into the ministry. You know, hadn't happened yet, but we'll see. I'm only 51 on Saturday, so who knows, right? But this notion that he's looking kind of below my appearance to really understand the depth of me, everybody doesn't do that. They're actually responding to me at the group stage. And so my Blackness is something that I always have to own and I always have to carry. And I can't be indemnified from my Blackness by my faith-based identity, by my intellectual credentials, you know, by my good taste in marriage. You know, none of that indemnifies me from being a Black man in America. So the combination of how we wrestle with those and really being reflective on the balance that they can create for shaping our experience, I think is going to be one of the real threads that we should consider as we're working out how to heed the call of racism, particularly in the faith-based community.
Right. I love that, Robert. And the only final thing I say, Jessica, there is that, you know, whether you you know, walked into a synagogue or a church, a mosque, a hike in Marin, a walk through Central Park, a quiet place by a river in New Jersey. I believe that, and this is part of my beliefs as an educator, I believe in the fundamental goodness of all people. I really do. I mean, there might be a short list with a few people on it, but essentially, I believe that we want the same things. And whether we're looking at, you know, Deuteronomy when we're talking about justice, but, you know, we've got to seek justice as people, or you're looking at this idea of repairing the world, or you are thinking about what you are called to do as a person who wants to embody Christ, if you're a Christian or Muhammad, like, everybody is striving to belong to something larger than themselves. I really believe that, whether you're standing on top of the mountain or standing on the bima or sitting in a quiet place anywhere, everyone is called to action, because we do want, you know, to be in a world that is fundamentally good. And because of that, then we all have to roll up our sleeves. We can't just sit. I always say at school, hope is not a strategy. So hoping for it and wanting it is one thing. We're called to it and we want it. But then we have to be willing to roll up our sleeves and say, if I perish, I perish. What hill am I gonna die on? You know, people talk about the coronavirus and, oh my goodness, are these protests going to somehow lead to a surge in cases of COVID-19? And I said, you know what, here's the thing. The very reason that more Black people and brown people are impacted and are dead because of this virus is because of systemic racism. So you got to ask yourself, going out into the march is to dismantle racism, has to deal with getting at the root cause. Now, some people may say, you know what, if it's okay if I, you know, contract this horrible, you know, virus, because I'm trying to make sure that the very reason that Black people are disproportionately affected, I'm trying to get rid of that, not simply to avoid this one thing. So it's a really interesting thing about which came first, the protest or the thing that caused the deaths of people. And what am I really getting at? Am I getting at the leaves or am I getting at the root? So I find it really interesting how we set ourselves up to be active in the world, and for what reasons will we go into the world and risk harm to our own selves.
I love so many of the things that both of you said. First of all, Wanda, the image of the shofar, just this ram's horn, which at its core in Jewish lore awakened Abraham from the near sacrifice of his son Isaac, and has continued to be the clarion call to not only justice, but to waking up. Yes. You know, look around and see what's going on. And the impact of this ram's horn can be so tremendous that it could actually cause these great walls to tumble down. Gives me so much hope, this notion that the fundamental values that we have that come from our sacred traditions or our communities, or the values that have been passed down to us through our families and our ethnicities, our ethnic groups, inspire and enliven us to know that something as untechnically fancy as a shofar might actually change the whole entire world.
Absolutely. Peace is loud. Peace is loud, right?
Nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Many things that have changed with people whispering, right?
Wow. And I love what you both said too about belonging to so many communities. I think there was a study done that was written up in the New York Times that I've often quoted since. I was in New York on September 11th, and so I feel very, you know, sort of connected to that trauma experience. And there was an article about children and their response to trauma following 9/11. And the kids who knew their own family stories and community stories best weathered the trauma best. They came back knowing who they were and where they came from and what was expected of them, in a way that allowed them to survive this really horrible, horrible experience. It really applies here in terms of the way that we approach the world, coming from our own individual ethnic and racial and religious circles of community.
Oh, absolutely.
Robert, will you talk a little bit about, you guys mentioned your two wonderful boys. Will you talk a little bit about what it feels like to be raising Black boys in this world that we live in? And Wanda, as you have mentioned also, your constant awareness of being married to a Black man, walking down the street and doing everything that you do. How does that weigh on you, and what lens do you look through as you look at the world?
Absolutely. It's such a, in some ways, it's such a daunting proposition to raise Black boys in America. And part of the reason is because we invest a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of hugs in making sure that they have a grounding in values and ethics and morality and kindness, and that there's something about them that people want to get next to. There should be something about them that resonates in terms of their goodness, in terms of their humanity. And despite all that, the world still sees them first as Black boys. And remember that Dave Chappelle once told Oprah Winfrey, he asked her, in fact, he said, "What's the Black man in America without his paranoia intact?" And it's a shocking phrase. It hangs on your ear, but it's really how, it's one of the most true things I've ever heard. And it's one of the most descriptive phrases for how I have to move through the world, particularly in San Francisco, where Black people are not a large part of the population, particularly the neighborhood that we're in, where we're even less prominent in terms of the population. And then all of the bias that's attendant to Black males and to Black people, it makes it in many ways a minefield. And so when people look at me from across the street, or they look at me approaching, in addition to being a Black father, I'm also a Black man who's moving through this space. So this is part of my racialized identity. So I'm very conscious that not everybody in my space is being intentional about making sure that my life matters, that my Blackness is not a detriment to my existence, that my Blackness is not associated with my inhumanity. And so everything that I know about the world, and I'm carrying with me in the world, we have to arm our boys to deal with. And so part of the question we used to have with some of our friends is, when do we open up this conversation about the role that their identity will play on their experiences? And we chose to do it as soon as possible, because for us, to wait would have been irresponsible. To wait would have left them unprepared. And we had to name those dynamics directly. So, almost before Jonathan was tall enough to be able to see over the table, he had to, and this is the younger son, he had to have an understanding that he can't have the same kind of Halloween costume that some of his friends do, because he's going to be looked at differently. And there will be a different cost for the mistake for him than from some of his friends who have a different racialized experience in the world. And for us, it's not being defeatist. We didn't associate Blackness with inferiority, but what we did associate his Black identity with is an additional responsibility to be aware. And again, identity is dichotomous. It's not simply what you radiate out. It's not simply what we instill in him and in David, the belief that we give them in their capability, in their, the talent that they have, the support that they have to make their dreams a reality. That's not simply what their identity is. Their identity is also exercising that faith and that resilience, if you will, so they can go forth when some things are not going to be fair, when structures and systems are not necessarily going to be equitable, when even if they go to one of the parks here in our neighborhood and they're just bird watching, they might not be treated as some of their friends. So to raise Black boys is to be in a constant state of awareness. In some ways, it's to be in a constant state of fear that we can't protect them all the time, that something we have done is going to still leave them vulnerable to things that are outside of our control. So there are moments when, I don't get paralyzed because I love them too much not to act. But there are times when it's really hard to think about, okay, what are the choices that we have made, and how are they going to impact them? Because they're growing up in a world that that's even less likely because they are so rare in their identity in some of the spaces where they frequent. It's rare that people are going to see their humanity first and not see their bias first.
Yeah.
So to raise a Black boy in America is to be in a constant state of edge.
Yeah.
How do you teach that without making them fearful, Wanda?
Well, you know, there's a lot of, you know, love, you know, perfect love casts out fear is what my dad used to say. And we, you know, Robert said we teach them to be aware of who they are and how their identity is reflected back to them. That is absolutely true. I'm petrified most of the time, honestly. And I'm really not afraid of a whole lot of things, you know, animals sometimes, but I live in daily fear that someone's gonna shoot my sons or my husband every day. Like when they leave, especially when they all go into the minivan together and I'm home doing work, I often just say a prayer that they'll all come home, all three of them. And I don't know that people appreciate the cognitive load on parents of Black kids. You know, the research shows us that, you know, Black children are 18 times more than their white counterparts to be tried as adults. They're presumed to be less innocent. I mean, look, some of the work, I don't know if the name Monique Morris or Howard Stevenson, these are people who've done research on how people perceive Black girls and boys. They're presumed to be older. They're also presumed to be, to feel less pain. There's some interesting studies around perception of pain and Black people and what they're able to take. And the truth is we've come this far by faith. Like there's a lot of things that we've been able to endure, but it doesn't mean it feels good. And it doesn't mean that we like it. They're just, you know, if your children are presumed to be less innocent, older, and more capable of enduring pain, and you send them out in the world, it's terrifying, I will say. So we love on them. From the moment we could give them baths, you know, when we were putting the oil on their skin, it was like, look at that beautiful brown skin. Your skin is part of who we are. We love being Black. My kids would tell you that they have never for a moment wished they were anything else. We take great pride in that as parents. The music they listen to, Robert takes great pride in all the music artists and that the boys know. They could sing everything from a Yolanda Adams song to, you know, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes. I mean, we have taught them just the same way Jewish families do. You teach them their history, you teach them who they are, and you love on them, and you hope that there are enough antibodies in all of that teaching that will send them into the world feeling powerful. And instead of afraid, they can point that is someone else's negative mindset. That is someone else's ignorance, not their own. And it's not about who they are, you know. Robert and I have had many blessings in terms of our lives, but we are not under the delusion that because we've talked to them about the N-word, you know, really the N weapon. I think it's a weapon, not a word. But we don't think that the talk is going to arm them from the police. We think that their awareness is important, but is the police officer going to stop and go, oh, Robert went to Brown and Harvard and Wanda went to Columbia. We won't shoot this kid. I don't think that's going to happen. So, you know, recently in the news, there was all these crazy, and I call it crazy, notions that if you can just teach Black people how to behave, you know, they must be doing something to provoke the police. If we can just teach them the proper, you know, car stopping etiquette, then these police shootings will end. And I just, you know, kind of want to give them a Brooklyn look and say, you know, really, that's not true. So we can do all that we can, but we remain petrified. I mean, I think I can speak for Robert and myself and say we're pretty scared every day, especially as David, who is now taller than both of us. He looks like a man. And that just stops me in my tracks.
Such a painful and important message, I think, for all of us to hear, that terror that's there. And you posted a few weeks ago a picture of hands at the dinner table that just brought tears to my eyes thinking of the kind of pain in those conversations at the dinner table that would otherwise be a normal pizza dinner for a family, that turned to these places of anguish and agony and necessity to discuss. What would both of you say? I mean, it's so powerful to think that image of rubbing the oil and the lotion into the skin and to really to love and honor and cherish that which, you know, what you look like and who you are and where you came from. What would you say to all of us out there who in our own ways as parents, as community members, as educators, are helping to raise up the next generation in this country? How can that message of love and of honor and of dignity that you both work so hard to bring to your boys be a message that not only other Black families can certainly instill in their children, but other, as you said, Wanda, white, brown, and beige families, as you said in your beautiful letter to the Hamlin community recently that has gone viral, people can certainly listen to, and we'll be happy to send out a link. How can families of every skin color or communities with people of every skin color share that same message so that the next generation will contribute to changing the world?
You know, I'll quickly start and you know, thank you. I had no idea that when I, you know, wrote that letter to the Hamlin girls that people everywhere will now have seen that video. I was like, I would have put on some makeup. I don't know. But I'm just going to be blunt. I need every parent to talk about race from the beginning and not just leave that to the people who perceive themselves as being other. This idea that we are a world full of like people who are, you know, kind of the majority over here and then the exceptions over here. It's like racism leaves everybody, you know, in trouble, right? It gives this false sense of superiority to white people. It causes some white people, you know, to not even think they have a race, right? So the interrogation of whiteness as a concept, one of the things I love about what impact the video letter that I sent to our community at Hamlin is that some of the amazing parents, I love my community so much, they were like, Wanda, your video for the first time gave us a chance to talk about whiteness, because they were so afraid to engage, to talk about skin color privilege, to talk about being advantaged or disadvantaged. And, you know, look, I am an educator to my core. I am not interested in showing 5-year-olds, a picture of a knee on a neck. But there are ways. I mean, you notice that in the video, I did not give very explicit details. I said a police officer ended a man's life because I pitched that video from ages 5 to 13. But what I want to say is that we have to challenge this notion of childhood innocence. So many people have said, well, Wanda, we cannot possibly talk about these things with our 6-year-old because boy, would it ruin her vision of the world or his vision of the world or their vision of the world. And I said, well, there's a really thin line between innocence and ignorance. And often your need to keep your child innocent means my kid is going to have some horrible thing said to him on the playground. So, you know, I need you to teach your kid not to hate my kid. And I need you not to think that this conversation is some, you know, dark, you know, sinister conversation that you kind of open up this box at age 12. When Robert showed the definition of cultural competency, I remember having a conversation years ago with Beverly Daniel Tatum, just another extraordinary voice in this work. And we talked about, you know, this idea, like if you ask parents, do you want your child to be competent in mathematics? Like everybody would raise their hand and people would say, of course. And so what if we said, we're not gonna start talking about numbers until they're old enough? You know, well, you know, no, the world's really uncomfortable with numbers. You know, some people are sick and tired of dealing with numbers. So let's just not talk about numbers. And if you work with numbers, it's gonna involve risks and mistakes and you might not get the answers right. And you don't want that. So let's just not talk about numbers until you're ready. I mean, it sounds ridiculous when you're talking about math. But if you insert the same, you know, race for the word numbers, you know, it sounds ridiculous. To me, it's like, of course, if you want someone to be competent, you have to talk about it. And without judging and saying we're bad people and all of that, say, you know what? The world, this world, meaning America, wherever you live, America was built on a fundamental idea that has no biological basis, that has a persistent impact on how we live today. And I want to tell you about it. And without shame and guilt and all, like, we don't need pity, you know? What we need are people to be honest with themselves about the power and privilege that they have been granted, not by virtue of doing anything, but to be honest about it, and then teach your children to move in spaces. And someone said, you know, not to learn about Black people just through films and television and think they know everybody, you know, who's Black because they like Jay-Z and Beyonce. I like them too, but they don't represent all Black people. But to give people unique, authentic experiences, being proximate with people who are different from them, and not relying on social media and the screen to teach about racial competencies. I don't know, Robert, what you want to add?
One of the additional ideas that comes to mind, and we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, and I think about some of our shared religious tradition, right, in Judaism and in Christianity. And some of it is, you know, just be a friend to my boys. And you have to understand the depth of that commitment, though. It's David and Jonathan, it's Ruth and Naomi. I mean, there's investment, there's sacrifice, there's an understanding for what you're going to experience and the role that I have to play in making sure that you're having an experience that I think is just. The kind of thing that not only would I want for myself, but I would actually want to be the best that it can be for you. So I think about when our boys go trick-or-treating, for instance, and you know, when they go with friends who are not Black, part of the way I show up is that the parents of those kids have to understand that they need to have also had that talk. You want my child to go trick-or-treating with you, then it's up to you to also be having that same talk with your child, that my boy's racialized experience might be different from yours, and they have to be prepared to be an ally for them in the moment, real time. And so there's no such thing that we can wait until 12 to have this conversation that you may have been having at 6 because you wanted to all go trick-or-treating at 7. So that's part of what it looks like for us to continue to parent Black boys. It's also what it looks like for other people to be part of the solution. To being anti-racist, you have to be very conscious about race, and not only my racial identity, but yours and how those differences manifest. That's the responsibility for all of us, because we are all imbued with the stain of racism. It doesn't just touch Black people. It touches everybody. It touches non-Black people too. You know, part of what we saw on Memorial Day in Minnesota was not just a failure and a death for the Black community, it was a failure for America. And let's not forget what also happened on Memorial Day in Central Park. Let's not be confused. You know, what does it mean for people to step in and be anti-racist? It means for us to confront the inner Amy Coopers in all of us. Even though we thought she had the right identity, you know, she had donated to Obama and voted for him, and she worked for Franklin Templeton, and, you know, they're responsible investors. But still, when the moment came, she looked at Christopher Cooper not as a Harvard-educated birder. Remember, his credential didn't indemnify him. He was a Black man that was simply asking her to do something she didn't want to do, even though she knew it was right. He was a Black man who had the temerity to step into the fullness of his humanity and to think that he enjoyed the same rights in the ramble that everybody else did. You want to be a friend, you want to be part of the solution, then you have to step into your own responsibility of confronting those demons that live within yourself, or within your family, or within your friend network, or within your professional network. Do you live next to her? Do you work next to her? I can tell you, we live around the corner from somebody who thought they were going to be Amy Cooper. Nameless, we're still not naming her, right? She's on the video, but she's around the corner from us. That's how close it is, not just to me, but also to you. So everybody has to take a role. They have to step into their obligation with fierceness, with courage. If we're talking about Blacks and Jews, just simply ground yourself in the roots of your strength and your history. to step into those moments that demand faith. How do we do it? Everybody has to take ownership. It's not just a problem for me and for Wanda and for our boys. It's a problem for everybody who wants to know us. Everybody who's showing up on this video right now and they're sending us shouts, sending us welcomes. That's part of how they are obligating themselves to us as well. It's not simply your values, you have to live them. And that shows up in practice, especially in the moments that it's hard.
The only other thing I'd say, Jessica, and this is, one of the things that I constantly hear is that for some reason, and I don't know, it's maybe all of us people, who we strive for excellence, but perfection and excellence are two very different things. And if we want to heed the call to anti-racism, we're going to have to hear some things we don't want to hear sometimes from people who need to say them, and we're going to have to be willing to look deeply flawed. And that is not a comfortable thing. Robert knows I don't like being wrong. I don't like being late. I take great pride in resisting averageness at all costs. I like running a school that is excellent. I have tons of parents on this call from Hamlin. They know I want to be best in class. I'm not interested in being somewhere in the middle. When I was in Boston at the Park School, shout out to my wonderful former colleagues who are on the call, we wanted to be best, and that's not a bad aspiration. But when it comes to dismantling racism and sexism and homophobia and all of that, you know what? You're going to have to make an ugly mistake. And there have been conversations at Hamlin sometimes that people don't want to have, because I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing. That person's going to hate me. And, I didn't mean it. And well, let's just say, okay, we know you didn't mean it, but let's just all assume that we are flawed. Let's just begin there and stop worrying. That's the beauty of anti-racism. We can all fight it. And as I said in my letter to the community, everybody's worried about being labeled as something. Let's just say, hello. And then there's some wonderful folks from Guatemala. Hi, Sherry, who's out there. But most of the people on this call are in America. Let's just admit that we have all inhaled the polluted air of racism, and it's in your lungs, and it's somewhere in your brain, and we are all fighting bias, prejudice, and discrimination, and we all have a role in dismantling racism, and it's going to be ugly, and it's going to be loud, and it's going to be messy. So stop striving to be the perfect parent who raises an issue the perfect way, and when you're in a room with other people in a school, you're always going to say the right thing. Just give that up. Give this perfectionism, this idea that we're never going to mess it up. No part of learning in a school or in life has come without the dips and the falls and the stumbles and the curves. That's how learning happens. So just please, just do me that favor. Wanda, I was going to tell you this, but I didn't know how it was going to come out. Well, I'd rather have you have a messy conversation with me than sit at home wringing your hands about what you think I'm going to think. Just have the conversation.
It's a beautiful message. I mean, it's about relationships and trust, right? And in those places of relationship and trust, we can begin those conversations. And if they're not quite right, we can recalibrate. Say, no, I think I didn't do that quite right. Let me try again, and open those conversations. What things do you think we can do? So we all want to contribute to a better world, and to a world where racial injustice goes away and becomes racial justice. And as you mentioned, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. It's our goal as a Jewish community, as a community of faith, as part of the larger world, whether people are Marin hikers or synagogue goers, or church goers, mosque goers. We want to make the world better, and it's our mandate. And what can we do? And I want to ask Robert specifically, you're mentioning Amy Cooper and the hideous and very different events that took place on Memorial Day. I think for all the people on this call and most of the people who are out there, we all, can I say all, probably all, have an Amy Cooper inside of us. We don't all have a Derek Chauvin inside of us. I hope that kind of, I mean, maybe a piece of it, but that kind of extreme, violent, disgusting, inhumane behavior, I think many of us would say, I wouldn't do that. But Amy Cooper, we all have an Amy Cooper inside of us. So where do we go with this? And how do we begin the process of transformation?
Right. You know, or even the other 3 police officers who are now indicted.
Yes. Yes.
You know,
With
so
our
they
hands
didn't have their knee directly on George Floyd's neck, but they stood by and watched. You know, so I often joke in whatever space I'm working, whether it's corporate or nonprofit or foundational or educational, you know, first thing we have to do is normalize our imperfection. And so people, as Wanda was saying, they worry about doing the wrong thing, and that leads them to being paralyzed. And I try to normalize it, you know, asking folks, especially in an adult community, you know, raise your hand if you're over 21. And, you know, they raise their hand and they think they know where I'm going. But I said, look, if you're over 21, we've already made tons of mistakes, and somehow we've survived, we've gotten through. So the notion that you're going to be perfect, you're going to do this right is an illusion, but let's dismiss it. Let's disabuse ourselves of that. It's not possible. You know, the best class I ever took to prepare me to work in independent schools in particular was a service management class at a business school, because one of the signature paradigms was about service recovery. So it's not that mistakes will never happen, but it's how you recover from them that's so important. And as we, you know, live in our perfect inhumanity with one another, sometimes we're not going to do the right thing. We're not going to execute in the right way, but it's how we recover from those moments. That's the best way to continue to build trust. Foundation of trust is vulnerability. And we all have to be that vulnerable to look deep inside ourselves at our mistakes. You know, I will often joke with clients that I wake up every morning and I look in the mirror and I'm hoping Denzel Washington is looking back at me. You know, at least Taye Diggs, right? Some of y'all are laughing a bit too hard here, right? But it never happens. But it's that process of taking that look, right? It's the process of taking that look that starts me on the foundation for being part of the solution. So we have to be introspective, first of all. We have to dig into our own racialized experience and understand what that's meant to us and how that shaped our walk through this world. And right now, I'm talking specifically about race because that's the moment, all right? We have to deal with each of those 15 different dimensions of cultural identity, but we have to dig deeply into what that means for us and develop that understanding. That means we got to do our own work. And it means that we have to invest in taking the time to learn more than we can, to transcend the limits of our own perspective, and then to socialize a little bit of that understanding with someone else who has a different perspective, maybe even has a first-person experience. So you're not going to be able to partner with Wanda and with me effectively to help us parent Black boys if you said that all you've done is pick up Ta-Nehisi Coates, you know, Between the World and Me, and you've read it. Because the first thing I'm going to ask you is, have you discussed that book with a Black father? And if not, have you at least discussed it with a father? Because if we don't take those extra steps, because Black fatherhood is central to that narrative, if we don't take the extra steps to transcend the limits of our own perspective, we're not really doing sufficient work to be prepared to step into the world as an upstander and not a bystander. All right. And I know, Jessica, we were talking about this, and you know, the folks who are on from Boston, you know, it's the cradle of facing history as well. So this paradigm of being upstanders and not bystanders lives in a very real way in curriculum. It should live in a very real way in schools. It should live in a very real way in our organizational systems. Do your work, understand what's going on in terms of a disaggregated experience, because I can promise you that Jews who are white and Jews who are not white are having different experiences at times in their Judaism, depending on where they go. Blacks who are Christian and whites who are Christian are often having different experiences in their Christianity, depending on where they go. So you have to do your own reflection, and you have to develop understanding beyond who you are. Understand what somebody else is going through, and then you have to commit yourself to a shared vision of justice and equality. And for us, it's not enough to be not racist, because to be neutral means that you allow the inequity to persist. Racism not only has its own inertia, it has its own momentum, and we have to interrupt it. And the only way to do that is to be anti-racist, and that is to recognize and deconstruct racist systems, take them down, and then build up systems that are just and anti-racist. So my David and Jonathan and your David and Jonathan can walk through the world, and both of them can go as far as their talent and their work will take them, not be limited by their racial identities. That's the start. It's not the finish, but that's a healthy start.
You know, I would agree with you, Robert, and I'm glad you're Robert. We have our wedding anniversary this weekend, so I'm glad you're not Tay Diggs. But I think it's really important to say that Robert and I come to this world and this work through education. I've wanted to be a teacher my whole life. I can't remember wanting to be anything else. It is my calling in life to lead schools and to be an activist through education and to help other leaders do the same. And I do believe that part of the work, in addition to, you know, the learning, when people say, what can I do? I want people to ask, what can I learn? So that what I do is informed, right? People jump to the what can I do before they actually have an informed sense of history, and they haven't done enough interrogation. I'm not saying you have to wait, you know, too long, but I think there has to be a balance between educating oneself and also and moving into action. But I think schools have a big role to play. The people who, you know, are sitting in our government right now, they all went to school. There are often days when I'm just like, who was so-and-so's teacher? Like, don't you wonder, I won't call out any particular politicians right now, but don't you wonder who was so-and-so's third grade teacher? What did they say? What didn't they say? What kinds of conversations did they have? What kind of history book were they using? So everybody in this world, whether you have children in your home, children in your neighborhood, your godparents, grandparents, aunties, uncles, next door neighbors, I think that part of what we need to do is press on schools to do the work, because that's where humans start. And if you lose the first 18 years of someone's life, we have missed an opportunity to equip them with tools. I mean, if I stood up for a moment, I would show you a portrait of a first grader who sent it to me, a portrait of George Floyd that she did. And she sent me this little note. And let me tell you, that little 6-year-old Hamlin girl, I can't wait. I'm praying for school reopening in the fall. But, you know, well, we'll reopen, I mean, on site. But this is a girl who understands, like, she knows what happened in the news. And I imagine that she had a conversation, and she wrote me a beautiful letter about wanting to do something in the world and using her Hamlin girl voice. I'm not saying that every school has to be Hamlin. I'm a product of public and private schools. But I also know, and a shout out to the wonderful educators on this call, Lana Corder and the others who took such good care of our babies when they were little and had them feel tremendous pride in who they were from the very, very beginning. But we've got to press on schools to do the work. And if your child has gotten to November in kindergarten and you haven't seen books or heard conversations about the world, then you should ask, what's the plan for ... And Hamlin is doubling down. I know Beth Hall, our wonderful lower school division head, is on this call. My team is, some of them are on this call. We're talking about, like, let's double down on anti-bias education. Where are we failing? Where are we succeeding? How do we get better? It can't just be that we're all trying to get better at distance learning, although that's important too, given the COVID environment we're living in. But how do we push on public and independent education to do the work? Because we're in the business of growing human beings. And if we miss that, it's much harder, not impossible, to manage adults. But I believe we can influence the next generation. It's why I do what I do every day, because it makes me feel alive and purposeful in the world. So find a kid, particularly find a poor kid. You know what I mean? Part of the Robert and I sit here, you can see I'm in my Pacific Heights office, which is right next door to my Pacific Heights home. You know, I'm a first generation college graduate, but I'm a college graduate now and have put myself in a financial position that is very different. Our children are growing up in ways where there's a large buffer. Someone once told me that the definition of privilege is the amount of buffer between you and pain, suffering, and death. It's a fabulous definition. Again, privilege is the amount of buffer you have between you and pain, suffering, and death. And my kids have a ton of buffer. And we have created a life where we have a ton of buffer. Find communities where the buffer is nil. and step into that space in the meantime. As we try to heed the call to anti-racism in the larger systemic context, in the meantime, you can also find a kid. You can give a scholarship to someone who's struggling. You can make sure that someone doesn't get evicted, because it takes a lot less money to pay someone's rent than to rehouse them once they are homeless in the city. So find the disenfranchised, find the marginalized, and without, that ugly pity and noblesse oblige, go to the core, because at the root of so much of what has impacted people around racism is the poverty and lack of access that results in brown and beige communities and Black communities, that people don't have access. So if you have privilege, this idea of shared power, give some away. Give some away. A lot of us have more than we need. And again, that's part of these conversations we can have with children very early on. They know about fairness and unfairness and who has too much. Just cut a piece of cake and make a slightly bigger piece, at a birthday party, and the kid will tell you right away who has more. They'll start talking right away. We can teach children about power and privilege right away. And I think schools, summer camp right now, who's not in summer camp? What kind of enriching experiences can we provide for children? I really think that children are the way in.
That's right. Wanda, I just add, it's not just a gift, that's an investment. So you're investing in a common humanity, because the investment you make in somebody else, that could be the key that is going to help you down the line. That's what we're doing. Each of us is tied to this, is inextricably linked to this fabric, this shared destiny, this shared humanity. And so it's up to us to invest. That's what it's about. Invest in your family, and then invest outside of your family.
Wow. Well, the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, also gave the world these words: love your neighbor as yourself. And as simple an idea as it sounds like at first, it has been a challenge for all of humanity since the time that those words were given until now, to figure out how to live those words. We are so incredibly grateful to both of you, Wanda and Robert, for opening this conversation and this dialogue in our neighborhood. And as far I know, as Guatemala, I don't know how much farther than that this conversation has gone today, but it was also taped and will be available to people who are not able to be with us today. This is a conversation that I think we should listen to over and over and over again until we understand how we can move the conversation in our own families, in our own lives, into action. And we are just so, we are so thankful for your contribution, not only to this conversation, but to the world, as you continue to educate the next generation and this generation of leaders to understand what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I will say, just from the chat, there have been a lot of conversations, and I'm going to ask Peter to screenshot it so that you can see everybody's comments, because you weren't able to do that while you were speaking so eloquently. But there have been a lot of suggestions that one or both of you run for president of the United States of America. So I just want you to know that, and I want you to know that you'd have a lot of votes if you were to do that. So thank you. Thank you both.
We are so grateful. Thank you. Thank you. And we are happy to answer the questions. We see some questions. And so if people just make sure we have your contact information, we're happy to be in dialogue or do this again if you ask us. It's been fun working with you, honey.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. The only reason I would not want you to become president is actually because I want you to run the school that my daughter is about to go to. So in a few years, you're more than welcome and encouraged to become the co-presidents of the United States. But for now, I need you at the Hamlin School. Love you guys, and thank you. And I look forward to a world that is built on justice. Thank you all.
Thank you.